to carry on with where we are in 2 Corinthians. Paul is in this part where there are a group of people who have intruded into the church, and they've come bearing great credentials and making great claims about themselves. And they are also astute. They know the kind of things that the Corinthians love, and they play right into their sweet spot. And they have had an enormous influence and an inroad into what is going on in Corinth. And Paul feels he has to respond to them, but the Corinthians aren't ready just to hear what he has to say. He has to address them in terms that they will then understand. And it puts them in a difficult place because these people are boasters. Paul does not want to boast, but the Corinthians, that is, seem to be drawn to that like bees to honey, or whatever we want to say, flies to honey. And so how does he respond? Does he just give the calm answer? And he feels himself forced to sort of answer in kind. And he's about to enter into what he's going to call fool's talk. So that's why I titled it that way tonight. Because he is going to talk in a way he doesn't like to talk. He doesn't think is honoring to Christ, but it's the only way feels he can get through to these people. So let me pick up where we are, and we're just going to look at a few verses, chapter 11 and verse 16, and go down to halfway through verse 23. So, Paul says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do accept me as a fool, or regard me as a fool, so then I can boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say, not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if somebody makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs. Actually, lords it over you would be a better way of rendering that idea. Or strikes you, beats you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But what anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman. We'll stop there. He now will go on to a long list of talking about his own life and characteristics of it. So let me just review a little bit. Paul's making it very clear what he thinks about these people who are pressing in. Back in chapter 2 and verse 11, chapter 11 and verse 3, he says, I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts are being led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So these people are like Satan seducing you, and they're leading you away from Christ. And then he gets more specific. If someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you've received a different spirit, a different attitude than the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with that readily enough. So he believes that they are Satan-like in their deception, that they have a different gospel, a different spirit, a different Jesus. And then, as we noticed at the end of last time, he's come even more directly, and he says in verse 13, such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. It's no surprise that his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will be according to their deeds. So the strongest possible language Paul could use unimaginable to think of what he could say more directly to say, these people are false. He still knows the Corinthians aren't convinced by that. And he's got to, as it were, answer in kind. So he, in verses 16 to 18, is introducing this idea. I'm going to talk to you like I was a fool. I'm going to do what the Corinthians do, or these people do, and that you Corinthians love. So the first thing he does is give a request. Now, this section is full of sarcasm and irony. And so if you have trouble with sarcasm, you have a lot of trouble with Paul right here. I repeat, he says, let no one think me a fool. But verse 1 of chapter 11, he'd begun with, I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. And that word is going to keep coming up over and over. This is foolish. And then you remember what we just read in verse 23. I'm talking like a madman. I'm talking like a crazy man. But his point is to boast, to praise yourself, to say all of these things in self-commendation is the foolishness, which is the wisdom of the world and the kind of things that the Corinthians in their culture accepted as legitimate. But he said, I'm not a fool. I don't want you to think I'm a fool, but there's some who are claiming that I'm a fool, so welcome you as you would welcome a fool. And his point is, you seem to use our language. You seem to receive fools gladly, so welcome me as I play now the fool in front of you. And so I'm going to boast a little bit. Welcome me. Accept me is the way the English Standard Version translates it, but it's more a word, welcome me. So here I come. And then he backs away because he immediately wants them to know, I'm playing a role here. I'm playing a game. What I'm saying in this, with this boastful confidence I'm using, I say not as the Lord would. This is not the way the Lord Jesus talks. He was not a self-inflator. He was not a self-promoter. And so this talking is not like the Lord. And I want to imitate the Lord. As a matter of fact, he'd said earlier in this that I beseech you in chapter 10 and verse 1 in terms of the meekness and gentleness of Christ. That's how I want to talk. But you listen to fools, so I'm speaking to you as a fool. Now, he doesn't mean the Lord never talked directly and boldly and made claims, but he didn't do it to exalt himself and to have people think highly of him. But he told, for example, the Jewish leaders very clearly in John chapter 5 and in John chapter 8 exactly who he was, things that were astonishing to them. And then he comes back to that again. Since many boast according to the flesh, that is, they boast in carnal things. I think the NIV normally translates this not quite accurately, but gives the flavor. Since they boast in a worldly way, as humans would, as unsaved people would. So talking like a Corinthian would, that is, your unsaved neighbors, I too will boast. I'm going to get on board with them. Now, his whole point on this is that these people are presenting themselves as Christ followers, and they are being listened to as Christ followers, but they are not Christ followers. And I want to come back to that in just a moment. But let's just look to this next part here. He says, you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. That means being wise in your own estimation. So he's said here, listen, put up with my foolishness. You gladly put up with fools, meaning these false teachers, because you're so wise. And that's full of sarcasm. They're wise in their own estimation. They're wise in their own understanding, but they are fools. So let me just pause there and push the pause button. Because as we look around us in the current world and different things in the world, it's interesting to recognize what goes on. What looks like is the wisdom of the world is in biblical terms, foolishness, sheer, utter foolishness. I was looking around for some things related to Easter, and I was looking to see and thinking, I wonder what liberal churches say on Easter Sunday. Because what do you say if you are in pretense Christian and yet you deny that Christ was the Son of God, that you deny the resurrection really took place, and so forth? So I came across this article, The Trouble with Easter, How to and Not to Talk to Kids About Easter. And it's written by a woman who is, well, she introduced herself. I just want to read through some of this, and I want to sort of bring up to date what Paul is saying now. As a children's pastor in a progressive Christian church, Easter is, well, it's rough. For me, anyway. I'm responsible for children from birth to 5th grade, and teaching this central Christian story to kids is one of my biggest challenges. No matter what I do with the Easter story, someone is likely to be upset. Now, you know that's the greatest sin that you can commit in many modern places, except the one people she doesn't care about upsetting are believing Christians. Now, that becomes very clear as you go through this, but somebody might be upset. If I tell it flat out, that is the Easter story as it's presented, I not only go against my ethos in regard to nurturing children's spirituality, but also be confusing boatloads of kids and the message of my ministry as a whole. If I don't tell it all, I'll certainly have folks more outside the church than within wondering what kind of heretical witchcraft I'm having these kids do instead. Because abandoning a central narrative of our faith would obviously mean I've turned my children's ministry into Hogwarts. I'm not really into the reference to Harry Potter there, but some of you may know more about it. Anyway, she says a few other things, and she says, that said, there are things I know I don't want to teach. So this is what she doesn't want to teach. And then she gives these in question mark. 1, I don't want to teach that Jesus died for you or for your sins. Well, I realize that statement won't psychologically damage every kid. If it damages one, it's not worth using, period. So I wouldn't tell anybody that Christ died for you because it might damage them. I'm sorry. So to that end, I can list hundreds of people for whom this sentiment is harmful. We have to find better words and be very intentional with our language. And the reality is, Jesus didn't die specifically for your kid. I know that's a bit blunt, but technically Jesus died publicly and grotesquely because he was a political and religious threat to those in power. Philosophically, theologically, I believe Jesus submitted to the judicial system of the day because he felt it was the right thing to do. And perhaps the most powerful way to communicate the notion that God's presence follows us, even unto death. All that to say, using the language of Jesus died for you is misleading. Second, I don't want to teach that God killed Jesus, wanted Jesus to die, intended for Jesus to die as the primary purpose of his life. Any attempt to teach the concept of a loving God while also delivering this narrative is confusing and jarring. This also makes the concept of following Jesus much more ominous and threatening than it should be. Third, I don't want to teach that Jesus died to save them from God's judgment or hell. This suggests that these children exist in a way that is displeasing or unsatisfactory to God, which further suggests that God is a being sitting on some throne, literally evaluating every individual life from afar, casting judgment and glorying in disdain. I have no idea what that glaring in disdain. There's nothing inherent in these children's humanity from which they need to be saved. Therefore, an atonement theology of inborn corruption in need of redemption has no place in a conversation with kids about Easter. Fourth, I don't want to teach that coming back from the dead is something you can expect to happen. Well, there's much beauty to be mined from the resurrection narrative. I don't think it's helpful, or I'll teach on this later, I'll read you what she does teach. I don't think it's helpful or healthy to suggest that resurrection is a present-day reality that our children can hope, wish for in their lives. The idea, I believe, hinders the grief process and doesn't help them to effectively process death. It's important for our children to learn to face loss gracefully, accepting the reality of that loss while being held as they grieve. So what on earth do we do with Easter? I don't have time to read all of this, and it gets more nonsensical. One thing to bear in mind is this: the point of the Easter story isn't whether or not Jesus literally rose from the dead. We're missing the point if we're fighting over the historical accuracy of a bodily resurrection. There's so much more, in big capitals, there's so much more depth to the story than that. Here's the lessons. 1, the way of Jesus is one of honesty, bravery, love, and kindness. Jesus set an example that we can follow, not by mimicking actions. That is, you don't have to be publicly executed to follow Jesus, but by walking the same path he walked, loving God, self, and others. Secondly, we don't want to teach new life, or we do want to teach new life often pops up unexpectedly. It brings us hope and comfort, knowing that our world sustains us, and that what has gone away is never really gone. That is what we experience when we sell something familiar and are reminded of a departed loved one. Things come back around, although not only in the way we expect. Say, when Jesus died, his friends were so sad and so confused, everyone thought he was going to be with them forever and could eventually become a great ruler, but that didn't happen. Our story tells us that after a few days after Jesus died, his friends saw him again. Then they were even more scared and confused. I would be too, but they heard Jesus tell them, I can't be with you forever, but you're going to be okay. In fact, you're going to do amazing things in this world. Keep loving, keep going and keep loving. It's not what they expected, but they felt encouraged and loved. And third, our stories often reflect what happens in our world. This year, I'm focusing on spring with my 3-year-olds through first graders. Children's bodies and behaviors often naturally reflect what the earth is doing. They are in tune with the seasons and are beginning to see new life pop up. The new idea of new life is certainly a theme plucked from the Easter story. But we choose to communicate it without using a confusing plot of betrayal, public execution, a vengeful God, and the walking dead. Fourth, I'll teach them our actions are our own. Even when our friends don't understand, we do what's right. Jesus' friends didn't understand why he didn't fight back, but Jesus did what he felt was right even when his friends didn't understand. And the last one is, even in the most difficult times, we can know we're loved. We all bear God's image, so God is never far from us. Enjoy this season of rebirth and new life with your kids. To everything, this is a season, and this is the season of life. Breathe it in, explore, create, play. All we have is this life. Let's live it well, even unto death. Any of you want to know the address of that church so you can go? I mean, this is being peddled as what is progressive Christianity. And you listen to this and you recognize that this is being preached from sermons, or in sermons and other things this way. There was Bruce forwarded me an article that was on CNN today, and it was a man saying that Pete Buttigieg, or whatever, the fellow who's running for president, he's a mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who's gay and publicly gay, and God made him that way, and he's been attacking Mike Pence, and he said, he's my hero as a Christian. And you begin to realize we live in a world in which people call themselves Christians, and they say things, and there's all kinds of people who will sit there listening to that, which is utter nonsense, saying, that's wonderful. Where did you get that? I'm going to use that in my church this particular week, or I'm going to say something like that. And that's progressive and it's understanding. That's the kind of issue, although this is much more far-fetched than anything that was going on in Paul's day, about a substitute gospel that uses all the words but then changes all the meanings of all the words. So Easter ends up being about it's spring and it smells like a wonderful new time of year, and anyway, tells children, the very things that the gospel says are true about them. They don't need to know that because that's all mythological, but we celebrate Easter anyway. So Paul is, the only way you can deal with that in some way is what Paul is doing, is that you can parody it, because it's too illogical to even begin to refute on a practical way. Why call yourself a Christian then? Why not just admit you're into Wicca, and Wicca worships nature, and what you're doing is Wicca and nature worship. It has nothing to do with anything Christian. And if Jesus is who you said he is, he was self-deceived and deluded in giving his life the way he did. It had no meaning whatsoever. So Paul is pressing in on these people to try and help them understand that they need to see what they're being taught for what it is, as nonsense. So let me go back to what he says in verse 19. He said, "You gladly bear with fools, being so wise yourself." And if you listen to what the media will tell you, even in our own day, about people who are teaching this kind of thing, or the people who's put on CNN today to say that this guy is my hero because of what he said, there will be nobody writing the verse and saying, Mike Pence is right, the man doesn't understand the gospel, which is what Mike Pence said related to him. No one will get published on CNN for saying that. But this guy will get published. He's getting, anyway, I won't go into all his particular pathetic and sad story. But in verse 20, Paul comes back and says, you bear it, you put up with it, you tolerate it. Your discretion is so low, you tolerate this because you bear with fools, being so wise yourself. You're so sure of your own wisdom. And more than that, they abuse you and they take advantage of you. So he uses this next verse, for you bear with it. If somebody makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or loads it over you, or beats you. That last word is debated. Some commentators think it's talking about emotional abuse. Some think that because teachers were known in the Greek-Roman world to use physical force, even on adults, and punch them and hit them in different ways, it may mean that there was physical abuse going on. But what he is saying is, because you have listened to their self-boasting, you let them run roughshod over you, and they are abusers. They are using you for their own advantage. So the first word is that they enslave you, probably because of their Jewish background. That has something to do with their attitude and use of the law. The second word, they devour you, is almost certainly related to the financial demands they are making. We've already seen they attacked Paul because he didn't charge enough money. The next word is they take advantage of you. That has all kinds of different connotations. They lord it over you because they're proclaiming their superiority. And on the other hand, they abuse you. And all you need to think of is the number of times cultic leaders, and even sometimes people who profess truth of the gospel, get in a position of leadership, and then begin to domineer and abuse God's people in different ways. So you can go all the way from David Koresh and what he did to that sort of break-off branch of the Seventh-day Adventists, and the terrible situation, or James Jones and those, to cultic groups, to the prosperity gospel teachers who say that if you say any criticism against one of us, God will strike you with a disease of your own, to others who begin then to prey on the flock, as the Old Testament says, rather than feeding the flock. So Paul now, and this is the height of sarcasm, says, to my shame. We were too weak to that. We were too weak to defraud you, beat you, take advantage of you, devour you, to my shame. And he doesn't mean it's to his shame at all. It's to his glory. And he's made that point earlier in chapter 7 and verse 2. I didn't take advantage of you. I didn't defraud you. I didn't mistreat you in any way whatsoever. And then he just sort of comes to that. Now, the last part of it, he is now launching into what is going to be the more concerted effort of this. Whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and then once again, I'm speaking like a fool again, I also dare to boast of that. So now he's talking specifically about these false teachers. Are they Hebrews? Now, all three terms are going to relate to the fact that they're Jewish. Hebrews probably means that they speak, they're Hebrews, but they speak Hebrew or Aramaic. They read the Old Testament scriptures, and they follow the way in which the Jews in Judea practiced Judaism. They're Hebrews. Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. That's the roots from which I came. Even though he was born in Tarsus, he was brought up, he says, in Jerusalem, and he lived according to the strictest sect. He was a Hebrew. And then the second term is, are they Israelites? And that relates more to their nationality. So Hebrew would be specifically a Jew brought up in Palestine and following that practice. Israel would be someone who's Jewish in terms of their heritage, and their roots are in the nation of Israel. Are they offspring of Abraham? And that would be probably in this sense, are they members of the covenant promises and what God has given and promised to Israel? A proselyte, that is a non-Jew by birth, could become part of the covenant people of God, part of the seed of Abraham in a spiritual sense, even though they were not physically that. So he's used all of those terms, and he says, in terms of matching credentials, in terms of their Jewish credentials, I match them head on. Now, are they servants of Christ? Now, Paul is not going to argue this at this point. He doesn't think they're servants of Christ. He thinks they're servants of Satan. But they claim to be servants of Christ. So for the sake of argument, Paul says, are they servants of Christ? I'm more of a servant of Christ. And all he's referring to there is, and he leads into this long list, and he'll describe it. But what he's saying there is self-evident. Paul has been an apostle who's served and built churches and planted churches and done all of these things. He won't mention any of those particularly, but that's clearly in his mind, that I am more of a servant. But he says it with this statement before and after. I'm speaking like a madman. This is not the way I want to talk, but you're forcing me to it. So now he's gotten down to specifics, and then we're not going to follow this list through. It's worth taking some time on, and in a couple of weeks we'll come back. We'll do something Easter week oriented next week, but he's going to come back and talk about specific things in his life. But Paul's whole point here is that these false teachers have so overpowered the Corinthians by the force of their personality and by the cultural astuteness of the way they did things that people couldn't see past the surface. They are disguising themselves as angels of light. And it's in the same way that you hear people stand up today and they talk and they use the language of the gospel or of the Christian faith, and all kinds will do it on Easter Sunday, and there will be churches around, and they will say, yes, we talked about the resurrection, but the resurrection that they talk about isn't the resurrection of the body of Christ from the dead. It's that Christ rose into the minds of his disciples to teach them a new way of living, which means follow the golden rule and be nice to people and care for the poor. Now, all of those things are good things to do, but that's not what the gospel is. So that's Paul's complaint, and his concern is, I've just got to try and help you understand it because you don't know what you're dealing with, and you're so arrogant. And the interesting thing is, and this is the watchword of the day, your arrogance of your intellectual capacity causes you to lose all discernment, and you can't tell the difference between true and false. And we see it happening on our college campuses. The stupidest things are said related to human sexuality and gender, and everybody bows down and they genuflex. And everybody's afraid to stand up and say, that emperor has no clothes. We're talking nonsense here. But, okay, you may have some observations on this, probably not questions about what I've said so much as observations or things that you can help us think into this area, because although the labels are different, the issue is very much an issue in our time. It's interesting that I can name names and I won't, but people who a few years ago were being invited to all kinds of evangelical campuses to speak on the campuses, or were known for blogs that we're having and were speaking at women's conferences. And when they then began to make a switch, and it was nearly all on gender issues, then now you read what they're saying, and the gospel's kind of vanished out of everything that they're saying. It's all now, it's like the Democratic policy positions. And I'm not making that as against Democrat, Republican, but in this case, it's the Democratic social policy is now what their gospel has become, with a little bit of godness thrown into it. And it's sad.
This makes me think, Gary, of something you've mentioned more than once before, and that's, I think in some ways we're all vulnerable to this kind of teaching, in some ways, modern versions of it. You mentioned moralistic therapeutic deism. And when you say it like that, it sounds bad. Well, of course, I don't want to be that way. But it creeps in many subtle ways. The idea that the goal of the gospel is for us to flourish, to feel better about ourselves, and to be nicer people. And the more we emphasize that, the more the cross can look offensive, especially to sensitive people. So I think in my own profession of trying to help people with mental health services, it's especially alluring. And I know a number of my colleagues that are therapists, and they tried to somehow integrate therapeutic thinking into Christianity. And I don't want to judge them, because after all, you do want to help people. You want them to flourish. And most of the people we try to help are not Christian. So I guess in sum of what I'm trying to say is that this is very challenging to me, looking at Paul's and your presentation here, what Paul is saying, that this has so many modern versions that can tempt us.
So let me, picking up on that, Richard Rohr is a fairly well-known progressive Christian. That's word now, although it's different from liberal Christians. Progressive Christians want to be seen to be more connected to the evangelical community than, anyway. He came out with 10 commandments for progressive Christians, or returning to essentials. There were 10 statements that he made that put what these are the ideas. Now, the interesting thing is you listen to these, and I'll read them. The interesting thing is that, I don't know who it was, I think G.K. Chesterton said that a lie is usually better done when it's stuffed into a curtain of truth. So all of these things have a truth in them, but they either disguise the truth or they practically ignore something else. So here's the 10. 1, Jesus is a model for living more than an object of worship. 2, affirming people's potential is more important than reminding them of their brokenness. 3, the work of reconciliation should be valued over making judgments. 4, gracious behavior is more important than right belief. 5, inviting questions is more valuable than supplying answers. 6, encouraging the personal search is more important than group uniformity. 7, meeting actual needs is more important than maintaining institutions. 8, peacemaking is more important than power. 9, we should care more about love and less about sex. 10, life in this world is more important than the afterlife. Eternity is God's work anyway. Now, there's some of those that you look at them and think, well, I mean, some of them are, you look at immediately and you think, what? Gracious behavior is more important than right belief. Well, but can you really keep behaving graciously if you have wrong beliefs? Is there no connection between what you believe and how you live as a result out of that? Clearly,
specific context. Specific social context.
Nearly all of those statements are, if you took them in a particular context, usually the context you want to put them in, as you're talking about, is one that's already influenced by Judeo-Christian values. Because if you don't have those, these aren't going to work.
Ask him about
Number 9, we should care more about love and less about sex.
What he probably means is we should care more about love than about maintaining a biblical sexual ethic.
I think if you begin to read, I think you would. I mean, I would agree. We should think a whole lot more about sex, love, and less about sex. But as you're suggesting, Jordan, he's probably, if they unpack that, it begins to say, as long as two people love each other, then everything else is fine.
Not just two, maybe.
Well, okay, I'll grant that. So all of these come in some way as, we talked about this last week, they come as a disguise because it sounds good until you then begin to press it and say, now what do you really mean by that? And what it says is not what they mean in terms of, so, except the last one is just straight out stupid. Life in this world is more important than the afterlife.
No, that's completely contrary
So,
to what the Bible teaches.
yeah, but it's also, I mean, granted that
The afterlife is much more important than life.
Granted that there is an afterlife, if that's what the question grants, it would certainly seem to think that 75 years is not as important as what's going to happen to me after that. So, anyway. So all I'm trying to say is this very kind of strange passage that Paul is working on here, as we begin to unsurface it, has a whole lot more to say about where we live and how we think than we might at first glance realize. Okay. Looks like you're out of business there for any more questions, Richard, unless you have some of your own.